In 2007, the United Nations General Assembly designated the 25th of March as the International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. The member states welcomed the proposal of the Caribbean community, supported by the African Union, to erect at the United Nations headquarters in New York a permanent memorial that would acknowledge the horrific tragedy of the transatlantic slave trade and remind all of its legacy. Rodney Leon, an American architect of Haitian descent, designed the permanent memorial. Its title, The Ark of Return, is a deliberate contrast to the Door of No Return, the name given to the final place from where enslaved Africans were deported to the Americas. The Ark of Return was unveiled on the 25th of March 2015. The memorial stands in a prominent position at the entrance to the United Nations headquarters. The Ark of Return is a constant reminder of the courage of the enslaved women, men, and children, abolitionists, and unsung heroes who helped end the transatlantic slave trade. It calls on us to acknowledge the history, reflect on its legacy, and take action to challenge racism and injustice. It promotes the recognition of the contributions made to the world by those who were enslaved and their descendants. The Ark of Return's triangular shape points to the triangular root of the slave trade. Triangles are repeated throughout. The marble exterior evokes the image of a vessel or a ship in acknowledgement of the millions of African people who were forcibly transported on slave ships. The white color of the marble recalls diverse African traditional beliefs and spirituality. In times of death and reflection, white attire is considered by some to be the most appropriate. There are three design elements of the Ark of Return: acknowledge the tragedy, consider the legacy, and lest we forget. The first element, acknowledge the tragedy, is a map inscribed on the interior of the memorial. This map illustrates the global scale, complexity, and impact of the slave trade. The slave trade lasted for roughly 400 years from the 15th to the 19th century. More than 15 million African women, men, and children were enslaved and forcibly deported on slave ships to the Portuguese, British, French, American, Dutch, Danish, and Baltic colonies. 2 million enslaved women, men, and children died before they reached the shores of the colonies because of the inhumane conditions which they were forced to endure. The second element, consider the legacy, features the engraving of a diagram of a slave ship's interior and a full-scale human replica carved out of black Zimbabwean granite. The diagram is of the Brooks slave ship, which sailed from Liverpool, United Kingdom, via the west coast of Africa to islands in the Caribbean. The engraving illustrates the inhumane conditions in which Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas during the Middle Passage, the name given to the route the ship took from Africa across the Atlantic. The human figure represents the spirit of the enslaved men, women, and children, victims of the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade. The element, consider the legacy, asks us to reflect on the complex legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, its brutality, racism, and injustice that persists, as well as the courage of those who resisted in whatever way they could the shackles and dehumanization of the slave trade, and the immense contributions they and their descendants made to the world. The third element, lest we forget, is a triangular reflecting pool, where the visitors can honor the memory of the millions of lives destroyed by the trade in human beings. We are encouraged to consider how we can challenge the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade that still persists today, evident in pervasive racism, prejudice, and injustice. We are reminded of our collective responsibility to build a world in which all can live in dignity, in freedom, and in peace. A just world where all can thrive.